Hi, and welcome to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm Ange, MacCabe, CEO and co-founder of Intuitive Performance. I'm a performance coach, HR professional, whole person leadership facilitator, and your host. The Human Side of Business podcast is fueled by the genuine curiosity to understand how personal characteristics and skills can be leveraged to drive individual and team performance, tangible outcomes, and ultimately organizational success within business. Each podcast is devoted to sharing knowledge, expanding our learning edges, and exploring the trends in corporate culture towards growing the emotional intelligence of organizations. I'm so glad you're here. Hi, and a warm welcome to the Elevate Business Podcast. Both myself, Ange MacCabe, and Scott Russ are your hosts. We have the pleasure of introducing you to Charles Dimmler, CEO and co-founder of Checkerspot, Inc. Checkerspot is a design-centric materials company enabling high-performance consumer products. They're innovating new materials with improved physical properties based on advances and tools for high throughput and predictive molecular biology and chemistry. Charles has an entrepreneurial focus on creating value while managing risks, as well as experience with cross-functional team building and disciplined project execution. Welcome, Charles. Hi, Charles. Welcome to the Elevate Business Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. We're happy to have you here. I'm super excited to jam with you and understand a little bit more about your role at Checkerspot, your journey from a leadership perspective, and really just dive in.
Awesome.
So tell us about your journey to CEO and co-founder of Checkerspot.
Sure. Well, I was born in California, but I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up outside of New York City in a small town in central New Jersey called Holmdel. And this is really only important because it turns out in retrospect that where I grew up heavily influenced where I would ultimately end up and where I find myself today, because I happen to grow up in a town that where Bell Labs was located. And that's important because this really small community was heavily influenced by math and science and physics. And so as I was growing up, that definitely had a positive impact on just opening up my eyes to the sciences. And it just pulled me in, especially to biology. And then ultimately, when I went off to college, I already had a feeling that I wanted to pursue the life sciences, but at that time thought that it would be medical school, that I was going to be a doctor, and had spent some time working in labs. I was pre-med during my 4 years of undergrad. And interestingly, like where I went to school, there was a core curriculum that kind of illuminated the humanities and things like philosophy and economics. And that was a really important catalyst because I ended up not majoring in a science. Like I was absorbing all of this like awesome science in the pre-med curriculum, but decided to major in history. And that ended up kind of pulling me down this path of the humanities and critical thinking and writing and thinking about kind of the most influential and significant things in history. And because of, being in New York City at the time, the influence of history, the influence of science, and the influence of Wall Street kind of brought me to investment banking. And so as I graduated from college, I went and spent a couple of years as an investment banker, a junior investment banker, focused on healthcare and focused on life sciences. And after a couple of years of doing that, decided that I was ready for a change. Like I really enjoyed banking. I really enjoyed working with really smart people doing important transactions, but I wanted to be a part of building a company. I wanted to be a part of creating value in the world as opposed to simply executing transactions. And I was also ready for a lifestyle change, and I wanted to come out west. And so I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. This was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I joined a biotech company that was developing human therapeutics and was really focused on the field of telomere biology, aging, telomerase as a target. They were developing oncology therapeutics, as well as innovating cell therapies to treat things like spinal cord injury and heart disease and diabetes as examples. And I ended up spending 8 years at this company. And then ultimately decided to move on and join a company that was using the same tools of biology, biotechnology, but not focused on developing therapeutics, focused on industrial applications. And spent another 8 or 9 years leading and building corporate development there before deciding with my co-founder at Checkerspot to leave and start Checkerspot. And we're definitely building on the shoulders of all of that accumulated past experience, and more specifically, the experience at this other company. And yeah, at Checkerspot, we're creating performance materials based on novel oils that we can manufacture through biology. So we use microalgae in fermenters to produce tailored or specific types of oils that then can be assembled. These monomers can be assembled into performance materials like urethanes and textile finishes, even used in personal care formulations and food and nutrition, and that have really interesting differentiated performance properties. And yeah, Checkerspot is now coming up on 6 years old. We started in the summer of 2016, and still a small company. We're at about 65 people now, and we're split between here in the Bay Area and Salt Lake City, Utah. We have 4 products that are on the market. We're venture backed. We've raised a little more than $50 million to date. And yeah, I think I would say very optimistic about what we're doing and how it fits with some of the just enormous needs that are so prevalent in the world today, whether that's climate change or whether that's creating materials and ingredients that are less harmful or toxic to people and to the planet. And yeah, we're starting to bring that to life with use cases and applications that demonstrate what's possible with this new technology as an alternative to petroleum and an alternative to the big commodity vegetable oils. We see a world that moves beyond petroleum, and I think the world needs that quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can kind of take a step back, Charles, and to, I guess, summarize a little bit about what you guys are doing, would I be right in saying kind of like it's developing sustainable performance materials for the future?
Yes, Scott, that's totally correct. But I would say it a little differently, which is that we're developing performance materials that have the added benefit of being more sustainable than the alternatives.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's really important to me, because I think to really compete, to really bring things into the world that people pay attention to, performance is first. We just see sustainability as a design constraint. We see that as part of our core values. We think of sustainability as a social responsibility, frankly. And all of that is foundational, but really to gain market share, to have a following, to have consumers and partners, there has to be something that performs better. And so for us, performance is first. And we often talk about just this misperception that there's a trade-off or a compromise between performance and sustainability. And that's a false compromise. It's a false juxtaposition. And we're in the early innings of showing how this is possible to do performance and sustainability.
I love that. And you can really hear your passion behind it, Charles, which really, when it comes to building something that's bigger than you, is needed. So it's great to hear that. Across the past 6 years, from a leadership perspective, kind of pivoting a little bit, what have you learned?
How much time do we have? So much. I mean, it's interesting. Like there's a whole set of experiences within Checkerspot that are rich with learning. But there are also other aspects of my life. For instance, being a parent. And I think it's kind of interesting that my youngest daughter was born right around the same time as Checkerspot was incorporated. Yeah. And so there's a very real metric or like measuring stick that I come home to every night, that I see my daughter growing and developing, and it's like tracking Checkerspot. The thing though about parenting, and actually it was my father before our first child who made a comment to me that I'll never forget, that really grabbed my attention. He basically said, Charlie, I think you're going to find that being a parent is really going to have an impact and influence how you lead. And honestly, even though I heard it, even though I won't forget it, I didn't know what it really meant until a few years later. And now it's one of the most significant influences in how I show up and how I lead. And so that's been huge. And there's all kinds of learnings around, especially interpersonal dynamics and emotions, and not just my emotions, but also the emotions of my colleagues and the team and partners, especially when these emotions are intense, positive, neutral, negative, when there's really powerful emotion, how to work through and with and manage these emotions. And so that's one thing that just really I feel easily comes to mind. The other enormous influence, again, outside of work, has been being involved in mountain rescue and search and rescue. And that, both from a leadership perspective and being an operations leader, understanding dynamics, especially in very stressful situations where fear is involved, where life and death is involved, and how to acknowledge and to lean into the emotions in those situations has resonance even in the context of building a company. And it also, when you're dealing in situations where lives are at stake or unfortunately at times are lost, it really puts things in perspective. It really, like, the things that we grapple with in the context of building a business that have a tendency to really suck us in or pull us down or create behavior patterns that maybe are less constructive. When you put it in context in terms of how they rank relative to other problems, that has been super valuable for me to keep that perspective, to put it in context. I mean, look at what's happening right now in the context of the crisis in Eastern Europe with the Ukraine and Russia. Exactly. I mean, the images and, families being torn apart and death and destruction, I mean, is the stress in figuring out how to manufacture and supply a customer that wants to buy our material, even remotely in the same zip code as a situation like that. And I think that there's just a lot about having a holistic view of one's life and of the world, and being curious and paying attention and taking inspiration and putting things into context to help manage, to help lead. And so there's facets, there's experiences that transcend, that are beyond Checkerspot. But yeah, Ange, it's such a good question, because there's so many different facets that we could potentially unpack around lessons learned. And I'm constantly learning.
I enjoy you, because what I'm hearing is like three trends, right? So what's going on in our personal lives, be it through our children, our spouses, our family, there's learnings from leadership there. And it guides our beliefs in how we're operating as a leader. Second to that, not second by way of priority, but the second trend that I'm hearing is like, when it comes to our concepts around social emotional learning or emotional intelligence. And that is a huge contributor to the success or not success of your leadership team, and your organization as a whole. And that in itself could be a whole series of unpacking. And then thirdly, what I'm hearing is, when it comes to worldly things that are happening, good, bad, or indifferent, being a leader and being able to look at that 60,000 feet and putting things in perspective and having that decimated amongst your organization is really important, because it kind of sets the tone that there's other things outside of what we're doing. And if we're really looking at priorities and problems, and potentially from a cynical perspective or a negative light or an overly joyous light, it might humble us, or it might realign us in the sense of being grateful that, we're trying to solve a problem around materials versus, something more grave in different parts of our world. So I appreciate you and bringing those different aspects to the table to digest. And kind of going back, stepping a little bit, it really resonates, especially around, your children molding you as a leader. My little guy, he's 9 now. And when we first started the business, it was so funny because he had said to me, he was like, Mama, I want you to start a business. And he didn't know at that point in time that I was starting a business. And so I was like, for sure, I think that sounds like a great idea. So the business is registered, doors are starting to open, we're celebrating. So I tell him, I was like, dude, I started my business. And I was like excited to share that moment with my son, more so than even with like the rest of my family. I don't know why. And he looks at me and he was like, when do I get to go to the toy factory? And I was just like, oh, dude, I was like, we're not building toys for children. I said, but we are helping, we're helping companies, we're helping individuals with things like their human skills or their soft skills. So we're giving them other things, is what I was trying to explain to him. And at that time, he's quite disappointed in me that we weren't building toys together. But since then, he could hear me from my office, whether it be coaching or doing things like this podcast or having really, deep or in-depth conversations with Scott and the rest of the team. And so now I can hear him, and he's, saying things like, how can I help out? Or Mom, did you think about this? Or, what about that? So it's really interesting that those things guide you. And on the flip side of that too, my son has ADHD and he also has a learning disability. And that really came in play from a parenting perspective, and also aligning things within our organization as well. And here's why. When your son comes home or your child comes home and they have really negative things to say all the time. So for example, and not looking for sympathy there, it was just a caveat to kick me off to where I am now. And it resonates, Charles, because, my son came home one day and he's like, I don't want to be here. He was 5 when he said that. And that I'm like, did I break him? Like, did I do something so drastically wrong? Like, what's going on? And that, being the type of person I am, medication wasn't enough. What else can I do? And that's where emotional intelligence certifications came into play for intuitive performance and myself, because if it's, I can work with my son and help him understand himself and understand what he needs from an emotional perspective, and then being able to translate that to communication or to something verbally or physically, imagine what we can do from a professional perspective. And so that those pieces kind of like really resonated with me, Charles, in the sense of, having those 3 perspectives around, your influences and your beliefs within your organization, the emotional intelligence piece, and looking at things that are greater to put in perspective or humbling.
Well, I just want to take a second to say thank you for sharing that. And it's a personal thing, and it didn't take us long to get into a conversation where there's that kind of exchange, and I really appreciate that. And just to kind of riff on it a little bit, I feel you just described something that at the same time is incredibly important, but one of the hardest things for many of us to take on board, which is we have a tendency to get so fixated on our individual experience, on what's happening in, the inner dialogue, the narrative in our minds, and at the expense far too often of whom it is that we're working with, dealing with, who's on the other side.
Yes.
And the concept of like showing compassion and empathy and really appreciating or striving to understand. And in this case, with your son, that I just feel is invaluable. And I feel it's one of the hardest things to communicate to others, to, yes, create the space to acknowledge what one's feeling, and at the same time, try to find ways to connect with where somebody else is, to meet them where they are. And yeah, it's really hard.
It is for sure. Because oftentimes what we're seeing, Scott and I kind of do a coach approach together behind the scenes or, front and center with clients. It's like, we come from a place of what you said and kind of riffing back, Charles, of that inner dialogue, right? So if there's a misstep or misuse of tone or an exciting tone, even conversely to that, it's how does it impact me first? And how do I want to respond? And how do I want to interact? When we find balance within teams and individuals and personal relationships, it really comes back down to, okay, this is what I need, and here's how I can say it in a respectful manner. Maybe it's setting boundaries, or maybe it's just simply communicating something. And then also too, but what about that other person, and how can I communicate for them, and how can I meet them where they're at? And using my son as an example again, and being my only child, I didn't have a second opportunity to correct some of the mistakes that I made. And having that kind of place of ego of, if I said no and he debated me, then what did I do? I stepped it up. Well, then here's your ultimatum. You can have this, or you can have that, or you can't have this and you can't have that. And it's the same thing when we're speaking to adults. It's just we use different words that are more articulate or more intelligent than we would to speaking to a child. And so what I learned from my son and also the supports that I had reached out to accredit myself and get myself where I needed to meet him where he's at is that I needed to learn what he needed. I needed to learn what motivated him, not from a place of ill intent, but the greater good. Yeah. I needed to understand emotionally, what does he need in that space? Because sometimes he doesn't want to problem solve. Sometimes he just wants mom. And other times, maybe he needs a little bit of a push. And I strongly feel that there's no difference in that in working with teams, right? So if you're seeing that someone is struggling or, very debative or maybe standoffish or overly engaging, then, those are flags to be like, okay, what does that person need? What's really going on? Because oftentimes coming from a place of fear or lack, right?
Yes. And with kids, I feel like it's more challenging or ambiguous, maybe even nefarious when you're dealing with adults, because we also have this trap of projecting or applying our expectations about how we might communicate or what we want to hear on an adult. But when you're interacting with a kid, I mean, what's one of the classic things with like the little guys, like the toddlers, coming down to their level, like taking a knee or sitting down and seeing eye to eye. Yeah. And it's impossible to expect someone who doesn't yet have the words to be able to communicate their needs. And that really puts you as a parent in a position of not listening to exactly what they're saying, but really asking deeper questions like, what's behind this? Are they hungry? Are they tired? Like there's a whole nother set of considerations. But somehow along the way, I feel like when we all grow up to adulthood, we lose that. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, the way that someone said something didn't meet my expectations. And it's like, well, what wasn't said or what's behind it? And we just have this reticence to have that deeper level of communication. Yeah. And just, the ability of people to communicate without saying a word,
right?
In body language, in energy. There's a whole level of communication that I feel from a leadership perspective, in my experience, I've only scratched the surface.
100%. And what we're finding is that oftentimes, when you go to executive courses or classes, it's talking about structure. It's talking about linguistics. It's talking about front loading or back loading conversations. And it's missing strong proponents around how to actually interact with people. And to your point, I can't agree with you more, Charles, because it's like we have these toddlers still running around in our brains when it comes to how we look at, interpretate, and then exhibit our emotions, our beliefs, or our thoughts. But then we have these expectations as adults that they should just be so. Right. Right. So when someone loses their cool, or when someone is indifferent, and it's not what we expect to come across the table or the Zoom room or what have you, whatever form of communication, then they're judged. And, they're automatically put in a certain place or personal bias in our mind. And it can really have a domino effect, especially from a leadership perspective.
And we delude ourselves, especially, I would argue, the more educated, like the more degrees that you have at the end of your name, we delude ourselves in thinking that we're highly reasoned and very rational and we can control emotions. Yeah. And that's just not the case. We're human. Like you can't deny emotion. And we love to think about how reasoned we are and analytical and, frameworks and all of these things. But at the end of the day, there's such a big influence of what we're feeling. And that ties not only to leadership, but it's also tied to our commercial strategy at the company. Yes. And it also ties to how we think about partnerships and customers and we have this whole strategy of empowering designers and product developers to really tap into emotion and tap into meeting these existential needs, but by delivering what people need, what they want, as opposed to trying to force it, as opposed to trying to achieve some agenda that we think we have.
Yeah. And I'm kind of curious to understand, like, how do you go both that? So like what I'm seeing is, oftentimes we're really sharpening our skills by having those letters behind our names on competencies, right? So the skill set to do the job that you set out to do, or the purpose that you have in this world. And there's a huge component of that rest of that person. So what about the other quotants, right? So what about our motivations? What about what lights us up? What about resiliency? What about our human skills or our soft skills side of things? And I think that's what you're pointing to, in the sense that, it's the organization's responsibility to ensure that there's something in place to allow their team members either to organically experience it or to be able to understand it and therefore apply it. I think I'm hearing.
Well, that's right. And I think that we're seeing more in behavioral science and in social psychology that there are things that previously we weren't able to measure.
Right.
Things like, I'll go all the way to the extreme just in the interest of time, faith and spirituality, and the correlation of faith and spirituality, which historically from a scientific basis have been hard to measure. But now where there's evidence in the literature around, well, what happens when you think about deeper meaning and purpose, and what parts of the brain light up relative to those that don't. And and you're also seeing in the literature things like, it turns out that there is a connection between that gut feeling and, like, quite literally in the gut, and just this, we're scratching the surface around the microbiome and like the connection between gut microbiome and, depression and, like these, deep clinical manifestations around mind that are connected, not necessarily to our body, but the things that are in our body. It's unbelievably fascinating to be alive at this time, when all of a sudden these things that previously maybe people intuited or they experienced, but couldn't really quantify. And so coming back to the concept of, the degrees, I think the most valuable thing around the degrees is illuminating a path to how to learn. And I only have a business degree. I don't have a psychology degree. I don't have a PhD. But the thing that I learned, like the most significant lesson that I learned when I was in business school, was how little I knew. And I couldn't become an expert in marketing or accounting or finance by taking the class. Like all the class did was teach you that there was this area of finance or there was this area of marketing or accounting. But you don't become an expert unless you devote yourself, unless you really go and experience it deeply over many, 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 many years. And among the significant impressions from my experience in grad school was how many people were at the pinnacle of profession, like wildly successful by most metrics that people could think of, who had this humility that would say, I haven't arrived. There is no destination. I'm still learning. I'm still figuring it out. It's almost, to kind of invoke a little bit of like, Zen thinking or Buddhist thinking, like this path to transcendence and enlightenment that takes a lifetime. And I feel like there's a lot in the context of leadership and in the context of emotional intelligence and in the context of meeting people where they are that get into themes of feelings and emotions and faith and spirituality and moods. And there's, the mistake and the trap that I consistently see is we get too caught up in our own narrative, in our own feelings, in our own experience, and don't break out of that. Don't break out of that to have a bit of detachment in the situation. Exactly. And don't break out of that to think about how can we meet people where they are, that 2-year-old or 3-year-old that's throwing a tantrum.
Exactly. And I have to tell you this, like moving forward with my own son, we're both in a place now where we can say, hey, I feel, or, and he's 9 and can articulate it. Maybe sometimes he's not getting the exact feeling proper, but he can tell me how he's feeling. And what that does is it deflates the conversation immediately. And then we can go into problem solving together or, more of a tangible conversation. And I think that's the same for leadership. I think you nailed it, Charles, in the sense of being able to not just detach from our styles, but being self-aware enough to understand our triggers. So I could say to you, Charles, like having this conversation, my initial response is this, and it's not just something that's logistic or has to do with numbers. And you could, or I could say, hey, I'm telling myself this script right now because I wasn't included in the original decision, or, I'm feeling like this is going on. And you could be like, well, no, Ange, this is what happened. And so it's like, okay, so then we can move on into the actual discussion instead of me getting caught up in proving something or disproving something. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in the process of trying to disprove something, not listen, because you're formulating exactly what you're going to come back with.
Exactly.
Guys, I hate to do this. I as much as I love I've sat back and I've soaked it all in. We're gonna have to do a part 2.
I think so. We didn't even talk about like
I don't think we asked one question.
That
was on the list.
We got one question.
Sorry about that.
No, it's been amazing.
It really has been. And so I guess shifting gears or kind of wrapping things up here just for the sake of time. We always like to ask our guests this last question here, Charles. And so if you had to leave the world with a few words of inspiration, what kind of comes to mind, or what would you like them to hear?
I mean, there's 2 things that I've drawn inspiration from, 2 quotes that I'll share, and then comment a little bit on that. One is Gandhi's famous quote of "Be the change that you wish to see in the world." And that, especially at this time and over the course of the last 2 years and the shared experience of the pandemic and the climate crisis and now war and unrest in Eastern Europe, and just the polarization, especially here in the United States from a political perspective, there's just so much angst and discomfort and struggle in the world right now. And I think it's a big mistake to just sit back and think that things will take care of themselves, and that, to find purpose and to accept the agency that we can all have is the path, I believe, to being the change that we wish to see in this world. And then the second concept or quote that I've taken inspiration from is from somebody totally different, Rainer Rilke, who said, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Life is beautiful. Often the struggle ends up being the most rewarding thing." And that seems so timely as well, because especially enabled by like information technology and how fast we can get like instant gratification, we've kind of moved away from embracing the struggle. And as I and others that I've talked to really reflect on some of the deepest, most meaningful experiences in life, there's quite often a strong correlation between the meaning and where things have been difficult and challenging. We were talking about parenting earlier. Like, what an example. Like, being a parent is extraordinarily hard, but it's also one of the most beautiful and deeply meaningful things in life. And I guess that's the final point. Like, when we think about being the change in the world and tackling really challenging things, to embrace the fear, to lean into the fear, to call out the fear, and to move towards it, and to take on that terror, because it's fleeting, it will pass. And on the other side of that, I feel, is the beauty and the meaning and the purpose in a life well lived.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. I was familiar with the first quote, but not the second one. Thank you so much for sharing and joining us today on the podcast, speaking on behalf of both myself and Scott and our subscribers.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I wish we had more time, because I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Fantastic. And for those that would like to learn more about Checkerspot, we're going to provide a link to the company's profile on the Elevate Business Podcast title page. Take good care. Thanks for listening to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm glad you could join us. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay updated with our latest content, make sure to visit our website. The link can be found in the episode description, where you can subscribe to the podcast, sign up for our newsletter, and learn more about our whole person leadership services. Sounds interesting? Explore the Whole Person Leadership Cohort by Intuitive Performance, a unique program that offers unparalleled support to managers on every step of their leadership journey. Our program features evidence-based assessments, workbooks, group coaching, and interactive learning experiences to help you level up your leadership skills. Reach out today to apply to one of our upcoming cohorts. Until next time, take care and stay curious.